The dust swirled around Elijah Everett like a devil's dance as he stood in the middle of Belmont's only street, his hand hovering inches from the worn grip of his Colt. The man across from him, a drifter with liquor on his breath and blood in his eyes, seemed to reconsider his challenge as he took in Elijah's steady gaze, the kind that came from a man who'd seen death up close and made peace with its proximity. "Might be best if you rode on," Elijah said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence of the Nevada afternoon. The townsfolk had scattered at the first sign of trouble, ducking into doorways and behind water troughs, all except for one. Madeline Griffin stood on the boardwalk outside her father's general store, her gaze locked on the confrontation. She'd been back in Belmont for less than a week, and already trouble had found its way to her doorstep, or perhaps more accurately, to the doorstep of the man she'd once loved. The drifter finally backed down, muttering curses as he stumbled toward his horse. The tension dissolved from the air like morning fog under a hot sun, and the townsfolk slowly emerged from their hiding places. Elijah's eyes found Madeline's across the dusty street. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she'd left Belmont and him behind. She looked different now. Her once wild chestnut hair was tamed into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and her simple dress spoke of city life and education. But her eyes were the same deep green and unreadable. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture somewhere between courtesy and accusation, before turning toward the sheriff's office. He had a job to do, after all. The weight of the deputy's badge on his chest reminded him of that every day. Madeline watched him go, willing her heart to slow its frantic pace. She hadn't expected to feel this way upon seeing him again. She'd hoped the years would have erased the memory of his touch, of his voice whispering promises in the dark. But one look, and it all came flooding back. "You shouldn't be out here," her father said, appearing at her side. George Griffin had aged in the years she'd been gone, the lines on his face deeper, his once robust frame slightly stooped. That man could have started shooting. "Elijah wouldn't have let that happen," she said before she could stop herself. Her father gave her a sideways glance. "He's changed, Maddie. We all have." "I'm not here for him," she said firmly. "I'm here for you. The doctor in Carson City said you needed help." "I don't need a nursemaid," her father grumbled, but there was relief in his eyes. "The store's doing fine." "I'm sure it is," she replied, guiding him back inside. "But I'm not leaving until you're better." What she didn't say was that she'd returned to Belmont with no intention of staying beyond her father's convalescence. San Francisco awaited her a teaching position at a respected school for girls, a life of her own making. Belmont was her past, not her future. But as she helped her father back to his chair, she couldn't help but glance out the window toward the sheriff's office. Elijah Everett had been the reason she'd fled this town in the first place, running from feelings that threatened to consume her. And now here she was, back where it all began. The bell above the store door jingled, and Madeline turned to see Mrs. Patterson enter, her arms laden with baskets. "Oh, Madeline dear, I heard you were back." The older woman bustled forward, setting her baskets on the counter. "Such a blessing for your father to have you home again." "It's temporary," Madeline said quickly. "Just until father is back on his feet." Mrs. Patterson's smile didn't waver. "Of course, dear. Though I must say your timing is fortunate. The town's hosting its first proper social in years this Saturday. The railroad's arrival has brought new life to Belmont." The railroad, Madeline couldn't hide her surprise. When she'd left in 1878, Belmont had been a struggling silver town, clinging to the hope that new strikes would revitalize its fortunes. "Oh yes," came through last year. "We've got new families settling, a proper school now, and even talk of a bank." Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled. Your young man has been instrumental in keeping the peace as we grow." "He's not my young man," Madeline said automatically. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "No." "Well, he never courted another after you left. 5 years is a long time for a man to wait, especially one as handsome as Deputy Everett." Madeline busied herself with arranging items on a nearby shelf, hoping her burning cheeks weren't visible. "I'm sure Elijah's personal affairs are none of my concern, if you say so, dear." Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she believed otherwise. "Now, about those supplies I need." As Madeline helped the older woman with her purchases, her mind raced. Had Elijah truly not courted anyone since she'd left? It seemed impossible. He was, as Mrs. Patterson had noted, handsome, tall, and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly when it grew too long and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sky. Surely the women of Belmont hadn't overlooked him all this time. But even as she tried to dismiss the notion, a small voice inside her whispered that it aligned with the Elijah she'd known. He'd never been one to give his heart easily, and once given, he guarded it fiercely. The memory of their last night together rose unbidden. The argument that had started as a whisper and ended in shouts. Her announcement that she was leaving for San Francisco to pursue her education. His plea for her to stay, to marry him, to build a life in Belmont. And her final, cutting words, "There's nothing for me here." She'd seen the hurt in his eyes then, the betrayal, but she'd been too young, too hungry for experiences beyond the borders of their small town to recognize the love that had been offered to her. Now, at 25, with years of independence behind her, she wondered if she'd been wrong. Not about leaving her education had opened doors she'd never imagined, but about there being nothing for her in Belmont. As Mrs. Patterson departed with her purchases, Madeline moved to the store's front window. Across the street, Elijah emerged from the sheriff's office, exchanging words with Sheriff Davis before mounting his horse, the same dappled gray he'd had 5 years ago. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture straight as a rail, his gaze sweeping the street with practiced vigilance. For a moment, his eyes found hers through the glass, and Madeline felt her breath catch. Then he turned his horse and rode toward the edge of town, dust billowing in his wake. "He rides the boundary every afternoon," her father said from behind her, "checking for trouble before it reaches us." "There's trouble in Belmont." Madeline turned, concerned. Her father shrugged. "Some. The railroad brings progress, but it also brings those looking to take advantage. Rustlers, gamblers, men on the run from the law." He paused. "Elijah keeps them at bay for the most part." "I wouldn't have thought he'd become a lawman," Madeline said, remembering the young man who dreamed of having his own ranch someday. "Life takes unexpected turns," her father replied, his gaze knowing. "He bought that piece of land west of town, the old Henderson place, works on it when he can between his duties." Madeline's heart quickened. The Henderson place had been their dream, once a stretch of good grazing land with a creek running through it, and a view of the mountains that stole your breath at sunset. They'd picnic there on Sundays, planning a future together that she'd ultimately rejected. "I should check your bandages," she said, changing the subject abruptly. Her father had fallen from a ladder while restocking shelves, breaking his leg and cracking 2 ribs. The doctor had set the bone but warned that at George's age, healing would be slow. As she helped her father upstairs to the living quarters above the store, Madeline tried to focus on the task at hand. She was here for her father, not to revisit the past, not to wonder about what might have been, not to think about Elijah Everett and the life they'd once planned together. But as the evening shadows lengthened across Belmont, she found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking westward, toward a piece of land that had once held all her dreams, and the man who might still be holding them for her. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the Nevada sky a vast canvas of blue unmarred by clouds. Madeline rose early, as had been her habit during her teaching years in San Francisco. Her father was still sleeping, his soft snores a reassuring rhythm from the adjacent room. She dressed simply in a blue calico dress, one of the few she'd brought that wasn't styled for city living. Her hair she plaited into a single braid that hung down her back, practical for the work ahead. The store needed tending, and she'd promised her father she'd manage it while he recuperated. The main street of Belmont was already stirring as she descended the stairs and unlocked the store's front door. Across the way, the blacksmith's forge was glowing, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery 2 doors down. It was so familiar, yet somehow different. New buildings stood where empty lots had been, and unfamiliar faces passed by, nodding politely. Madeline swept the store's porch and arranged the display of fruits and vegetables that had been delivered at dawn. She was marking prices on a shipment of canned goods when the bell above the door jingled. "Morning, Miss Griffin." Elijah's voice was deeper than she remembered, or perhaps it was just the formality in his tone that made it seem so. He stood just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands, revealing dark hair that had been recently trimmed. The deputy's badge gleamed on his chest. "Deputy Everett," she acknowledged, hating how stiff her own voice sounded. "What can I do for you?" He hesitated, his eyes taking in the sight of her as if committing her to memory. "Sheriff asked me to check in on all the businesses this morning. We've had reports of a gang operating in the area, the Hollister brothers." "I've read about them in the papers," Madeline said, remembering the headlines about a series of robberies across Nevada and parts of California. "Are they really headed this way? Hard to say. But with the new bank opening next week, we're taking precautions." He stepped further into the store, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "You'll want to be careful about closing up alone. Make sure all the windows are secured." "I've lived in San Francisco for 5 years," she reminded him. "I know a thing or two about urban dangers." A flash of something annoyance perhaps crossed his face. Belmont isn't San Francisco. Out here, when trouble comes, it's often miles from the nearest help. "I'm aware of the differences," she said, turning back to her task. "Thank you for the warning." She expected him to leave then, his official duty discharged. Instead, he lingered, his fingers tracing the brim of his hat. "Your father tells me you're teaching now," he said finally. Madeline nodded, surprised by his attempt at conversation. "At the Bennett School for Girls." "I teach literature and composition." "Suits you," he said simply. "You always did have a way with words." The memory of her cruel parting words hung between them, and Madeline felt a flush of shame. "Not always," she admitted quietly. Their eyes met briefly, a current of unspoken thoughts passing between them. Then Elijah cleared his throat and settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be by again later to check on things," he said, his tone returning to professional detachment. "Sheriff's doubled the patrols until we're sure the Hollisters have moved on." "We'll be fine," Madeline assured him. "Father's upstairs resting, and I don't plan to leave the store unattended." Elijah nodded, his hand resting briefly on the butt of his revolver, a gesture that seemed unconscious, a lawman's habit. "If you need anything, the sheriff's office is just down the street." "I remember," she said softly. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and left, the bell jingling in his wake. Madeline released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Every interaction with Elijah felt like navigating a field strewn with hidden pitfalls. There was so much unsaid between them, so many regrets and explanations that had never been voiced. The morning passed in a steady stream of customers. many of whom greeted Madeline with surprise and delight at her return. She found herself slipping back into the rhythms of small-town life with unexpected ease. There was a simplicity to it that she'd forgotten, knowing every person who walked through the door, hearing news directly rather than reading it in a newspaper days later. By midday, her father had made his way downstairs, insisting that he could at least sit in his chair by the counter and direct her in the management of the store. Madeline didn't argue, recognizing his need to maintain some control over his domain. "The inventory ledgers are a mess," she told him as she served him a bowl of stew she'd brought from the cafe down the street. "I've started reorganizing them." "Been meaning to get to that," her father mumbled around a mouthful of stew. "Just haven't had the time." Madeline bit back a smile. Her father had never been one for paperwork, preferring the tangible aspects of running the store, stocking shelves, helping customers, negotiating with suppliers. The ledgers had always been her mother's domain until her death 10 years earlier. After that, they'd fallen to Madeline, and later when she'd left for San Francisco, apparently to no one at all. "I'll have them sorted out before I leave," she promised. Her father set down his spoon, a frown creasing his weathered face. "You're still set on going back, then?" "Of course," Madeline said, surprised by the question. "I have a position waiting for me, a life I've built." "A life far from your only family," her father pointed out. "I'm not getting any younger, Maddie," guilt twisted in her stomach. "I write to you every week. And now that the railroad's here, I could visit more often. It's not the same as having you here." Her father's voice softened. "Belmont's changing, growing. There might be opportunities for you now that weren't here before." "Like what?" Madeline asked, though she suspected she knew where this conversation was heading. "The new school will need teachers, trained ones, not just whoever can spare the time." He looked at her meaningfully. "Sheriff Davis mentioned it just the other day." "And did Sheriff Davis happen to mention this while his deputy was present?" Madeline asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Her father had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Elijah might have been there, but the suggestion was Davis's." "I have a position in San Francisco," Madeline repeated, more firmly this time. "A good one with a salary that allows me to live independently. I'm not giving that up to teach in a one-room schoolhouse, no matter how new it might be." The bell above the door interrupted their conversation, and Madeline turned to greet the customer with relief. The subject of her future in Belmont, or lack thereof, was one she preferred to avoid, especially with her father. The afternoon brought a lull in business, and Madeline took the opportunity to continue organizing the store's chaotic records. She was deep in concentration when a shadow fell across her ledger. Looking up, she was startled to see Emma Davis, the sheriff's daughter and once her closest friend. "I thought it was you," Emma said, her face breaking into a wide smile. "When Papa told me Madeline Griffin was back in town, I could hardly believe it." Madeline rose from her seat, embracing her old friend warmly. "Emma, you look wonderful." It was true. Emma had blossomed from a gangly girl into a poised young woman, her blonde hair fashionably styled, and her dress clearly ordered from one of the catalogs that had become popular in recent years. "And you look like a proper city lady," Emma replied, stepping back to appraise Madeline's appearance. "San Francisco must agree with you." "It does," Madeline confirmed, gesturing for Emma to take a seat. "And Belmont clearly agrees with you. I heard you married Thomas Reynolds." Emma nodded, her face softening. 2 years ago. We have a little boy now, Samuel. He's with Thomas's mother today while I run errands." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "I've missed you, Maddie. Your letters were wonderful, but it's not the same." "I've missed you too," Madeline admitted, "but I've been happy in San Francisco. My work is fulfilling." "I'm sure it is," Emma said, though her tone suggested she couldn't quite imagine finding fulfillment so far from home. "How long will you stay?" "Just until Father is recovered," Madeline said firmly. "A few weeks, perhaps a month." Emma's eyes gleamed with a hint of mischief. "Long enough to attend the social this Saturday, then. You'll come, won't you? Everyone will want to see you." Madeline hesitated. The thought of facing the entire town at once was daunting, especially knowing that Elijah would almost certainly be there in his official capacity. "I should stay with Father," she began. "Nonsense," her father called from his chair by the counter. "I can manage for one evening. You should go and enjoy yourself." Emma clapped her hands in delight. "Then it's settled. Oh, Maddie, it'll be just like old times." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And you'll finally have a chance to talk to Elijah properly." Madeline shot her father a betrayed look. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, keeping her voice even. "That was all a very long time ago." Emma's eyebrows rose skeptically. 5 years isn't so very long, not when feelings run as deep as his did. She reached out to squeeze Madeline's hand. "Just promise me you'll come to the social, wear something pretty." "I'll come," Madeline conceded, knowing resistance was futile. Emma had always been persuasive, even as a child. "But I make no promises about anything else." After Emma left, Madeline turned to her father with accusation in her eyes. "You've been talking about me, about Elijah and me." Her father shrugged, unrepentant. "It's a small town, Maddie. People remember, and they care." "They should mind their own business," Madeline muttered, returning to her ledgers with more force than necessary. "Perhaps," her father agreed. "But can you blame them for hoping? You and Elijah were the talk of Belmont once. The schoolteacher's daughter and the rancher's son, planning a future together." "That was before," Madeline said quietly. "Before Mother died. Before I realized there was a whole world beyond Belmont. Before Elijah decided that his dreams were more important than mine." "Is that what you think happened?" Her father's voice held genuine surprise. "That boy would have followed you anywhere if you'd asked him." "But that's just it," Madeline said, finally voicing the frustration that had driven her away 5 years earlier. "I didn't want him to follow me. I wanted him to walk beside me, to see that my dreams mattered as much as his." "And you never gave him the chance to try," her father pointed out gently. "You made your decision and left before the dust could settle." The truth of her father's words stung. She had run, afraid of what staying might mean, compromising her dreams, losing herself in someone else's vision for the future. But in the years since, she'd sometimes wondered if she'd been running from her own fears rather than from Elijah's expectations. "It doesn't matter now," she said, closing the ledger with finality. "We've both moved on." But as she busied herself with straightening shelves and serving the occasional afternoon customer, Madeline couldn't help but wonder if that was true. She had built a life in San Francisco. Yes, a good life, with meaningful work and intellectual stimulation. But there had been no one since Elijah who had made her heart race with a single look, no one whose touch she craved in the quiet moments before sleep. And now Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. 5 years is a long time for a man to wait. Had he been waiting? Or had he simply never found someone who measured up to the memory of what they'd shared? The question followed her through the rest of the day and into the evening, haunting her as she prepared dinner for her father and herself in the small kitchen behind the store. It was still there as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant sounds of Belmont settling into darkness, a dog barking, the last customers leaving the saloon, the occasional creak of a floorboard as her father shifted in his sleep. Outside her window, the stars were brilliantly clear in the Nevada sky, untainted by the gas lamps and fog that often obscured them in San Francisco. She'd forgotten how vast the night could feel here, how the darkness wrapped around you like a blanket, both comforting and overwhelming. In the distance, she heard the steady beat of hooves a rider moving through the quiet town. Her mind conjured the image of Elijah making his rounds, vigilant even at this late hour, protecting a town that had become his responsibility, protecting her, whether she wanted his protection or not. The thought should have annoyed her, this assumption of his duty toward her. Instead, it brought an unexpected warmth, a sense of security she hadn't realized she'd been missing in her independent city life. "It's just nostalgia," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "It will pass." But as she finally drifted towards sleep, Madeline couldn't shake the feeling that her return to Belmont had awakened something long dormant within her, a yearning for connection, for roots, for the kind of love that endured beyond reason or time. And that was a far more dangerous prospect than any outlaw gang riding toward town. The days leading up to the social passed in a blur of activity. Madeline fell into a routine of managing the store, caring for her father, and gradually reacquainting herself with Belmont and its inhabitants. The town had indeed grown since her departure. New businesses lined the main street, and construction was underway on a building that would house the bank when completed. She saw Elijah only in passing a nod as he rode by on patrol, a brief exchange when he stopped to check on the store as promised. These encounters were cordial but distant, as if they were acquaintances rather than two people who had once planned to spend their lives together. Yet Madeline found herself increasingly aware of his presence, even when he wasn't in sight. She'd catch herself listening for the sound of his horse, or glancing toward the sheriff's office when she stepped outside. It was unsettling, this lingering awareness, and she tried to dismiss it as nothing more than the natural result of their shared history. By Saturday evening, as she prepared for the social, Madeline had nearly convinced herself that she was immune to whatever pull Elijah Everett might once have exerted over her heart. She was a different woman now, educated, independent, with a clear vision for her future that didn't include returning to Belmont permanently. She dressed with care, selecting a gown of deep green silk that she'd brought from San Francisco. It was more fashionable than anything she'd owned when she lived in Belmont, with a fitted bodice and a bustle that emphasized her slender waist. Her hair she arranged in a style she'd learned from a French hairdresser in the city, partly up, with soft curls framing her face and cascading down her back. "You look beautiful," her father said when she descended the stairs. He was seated in his chair by the fire, his broken leg propped on a footstool. "Like your mother on the day I met her." Madeline smiled, touching the cameo at her throat, one of the few pieces of jewelry her mother had owned. "I wish she could have seen me teaching," she said softly. "She always believed I could do it. She'd have been proud," her father assured her, "as am I, but she'd also want you to be happy, Maddie, truly happy." There was a weight to his words that Madeline chose not to examine too closely. "I am happy," she said instead. "And now I'm going to go enjoy an evening of music and conversation with old friends." The social was being held in the newly constructed town hall, a building that hadn't existed when Madeline left Belmont. It was impressive for a town of Belmont's size, 2 stories tall, with large windows and a proper wooden floor for dancing. As she entered, Madeline was struck by the transformation. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the space. A small band played in one corner, and tables laden with food and punch lined the far wall. Nearly everyone in town seemed to be present, from the oldest residents to young families with children darting between the adults' legs. Madeline. Emma appeared at her side, resplendent in a blue dress that complemented her fair coloring. She held the hand of a stocky man with kind eyes, her husband Thomas. You remember Thomas, don't you? Of course, Madeline smiled, extending her hand. Congratulations on your marriage and your son. Emma has told me how happy you are. Thomas squeezed her hand warmly. Thank you, it's good to have you back in Belmont, Miss Griffin. Madeline, please, she corrected. We're not children anymore. Indeed not, Emma agreed, her eyes scanning the room. Oh, there's Sheriff Davis. He'll want to say hello. She tugged her husband's arm. Come along, Thomas. Let's make sure Madeline sees everyone she should tonight. What followed was a whirlwind of reintroductions and catching up. Madeline found herself surrounded by familiar faces, all eager to hear about her life in San Francisco and to share news of their own lives in Belmont. It was overwhelming but also strangely comforting, this sense of being known, of belonging to a community even after years of absence. She was in the midst of a conversation with Mrs. Patterson and her daughter when she felt a shift in the air, a prickling awareness that had nothing to do with the crowded room or the warmth of the evening. Turning slightly, she saw Elijah standing near the entrance, his tall figure unmistakable even in the crowd. He'd abandoned his deputy's attire for the evening, dressed instead in a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly taken extra care with his appearance. He looked, Madeline thought with a catch in her breath, exactly like the young man she'd fallen in love with, only more assured, more solidly himself. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, it was as if the years between them dissolved. Then Sheriff Davis approached Elijah, clapping him on the shoulder and drawing him into conversation, breaking the connection. He still looks at you the same way, Mrs. Patterson observed, following Madeline's gaze, like you're the sunrise after the longest night. Madeline felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mrs. Patterson, really, she protested. It's been 5 years. People change. Some things don't, the older woman said with a knowing smile. Now, if you'll excuse me, I see Mrs. Davis needs help with the punch. Left temporarily alone, Madeline found herself observing Elijah from a distance. He moved through the crowd with ease, greeting people warmly, occasionally laughing at something said. He seemed comfortable in his role as deputy, respected by the townspeople in a way that went beyond his official position. He's done well for himself, a voice said beside her, and Madeline turned to find Thomas Reynolds at her elbow. Sheriff Davis is grooming him to take over when he retires next year. I hadn't heard that, Madeline said, surprised. Thomas nodded, his eyes on Elijah. He's earned it, kept the peace during some tough times as the town's grown, and he's been investing in his ranch bit by bit. Started with just the Henderson place, but he's added adjoining land when he could. The ranch was always his dream, Madeline murmured, more to herself than to Thomas. One of them, Thomas replied, his tone meaningful. Then more gently, you should talk to him, Madeline. Really talk. Before she could respond, the band struck up a livelier tune, and Emma appeared to claim her husband for a dance. Madeline watched them join the other couples on the floor, their movements synchronized by familiarity and affection. She was so absorbed in watching the dancers that she didn't notice Elijah's approach until he was standing before her, his hat in his hands. Miss Griffin, he said formally, would you do me the honor of this dance? There was something in his eyes, a challenge perhaps, or a question that made refusal impossible. Madeline found herself nodding, placing her gloved hand in his outstretched one. Deputy Everett, she acknowledged as he led her to the dance floor. His hand settled at her waist, the warmth of his palm seeping through the silk of her dress. Her own hand rested on his shoulder, and she was acutely aware of how solid he felt beneath her touch, how his height still perfectly complemented hers as they began to move in time with the music. You've learned some new steps, he observed after a moment, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "San Francisco has many opportunities for dancing," she replied, striving for a neutral tone. "So I've heard." His eyes held hers steadily. "You seem to have found everything you were looking for there." There was a question in his statement, one that Madeline wasn't sure how to answer. Had she found everything? Her position at the school fulfilled her professionally, and she'd made friends among the teaching staff and in the boarding house where she lived. But there were nights when the fog rolled in from the bay and wrapped around her window, when she felt a loneliness that no amount of intellectual stimulation could ease. "It's been a good life," she said finally, opting for honesty without revealing too much. "Different from what I expected, but good." Elijah nodded, guiding her through a turn with the same effortless coordination she remembered from years ago. "And now you're back." "Temporarily," she reminded him, his lips curved in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, temporarily." They danced in silence for a few measures, the music swelling around them. Madeline was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected, his hand at her waist, hers on his shoulder, their palms pressed together. It was both familiar and new, this closeness, like returning to a beloved book only to discover chapters you'd somehow missed in previous readings. "The town has changed," she said finally, breaking the silence. "People too," Elijah replied, his gaze holding hers. 5 years is a long time." There it was again, that phrase that seemed to follow her since her return. 5 years, a heartbeat in the span of a lifetime, yet long enough for paths to diverge, for choices to be made that couldn't be unmade. "Yes," she agreed softly. "It is." The music began to slow, signaling the end of the dance. Madeline expected Elijah to release her, to thank her for the dance and move on. Instead, he held her for a moment longer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm riding out to the Henderson place tomorrow," he said abruptly. "To check on the new foals. Would you like to come? For old time's sake." The invitation caught her off guard. The Henderson place held too many memories, too many dreams that had never materialized, yet she found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, the word escaping before she could reconsider. "I'd like that." Surprise flickered across his face, as if he hadn't expected her to accept. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, one that transformed his features and reminded her of the young man who had once looked at her as if she were the answer to every question he'd ever asked. "I'll come by the store around noon," he said, releasing her hand as the music ended. "If that suits you." "It does," she confirmed, already wondering if she'd regret this impulsive decision. As Elijah escorted her from the dance floor, Madeline was aware of eyes following them, Mrs. Patterson's knowing gaze, Emma's hopeful smile, her father's watchful presence from his seat near the wall where someone had helped him to the social despite his injury. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and more dancing, though Madeline didn't dance with Elijah again. She found herself watching him, though, noticing how he checked the doors periodically, how his gaze swept the room with the habitual vigilance of a man responsible for others' safety. By the time she and her father returned home, the moon was high overhead, casting silver light across Belmont's quiet streets. Her father was unusually silent as she helped him up the stairs to their living quarters, his expression thoughtful. "He's a good man," he said finally as she prepared to leave him for the night. "Always has been." Madeline didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I know that, father." "Then be careful with him tomorrow," her father advised, "with both your hearts." The warning followed her into sleep, where dreams of the Henderson place awaited dreams of sunlight on grass, of laughter by the creek, of promises whispered against skin. Dreams of a future that might have been, and now never would be. Or so she told herself as dawn broke over Belmont. bringing with it the day she would return to the place where her heart had first learned to love, and perhaps to break. Morning came with a clarity that seemed particular to Nevada, the air crisp. The sky a flawless blue that promised heat later but, for now, offered perfect comfort. Madeline dressed with care, choosing a riding skirt and jacket that she'd brought on impulse, though she'd had no specific plans to ride during her visit. Her father watched her preparations with barely concealed amusement. "You always did look at home on a horse," he commented as she braided her hair into a single plait. "More than any girl in Belmont." "Emma could outride me any day," Madeline reminded him, securing the end of her braid with a ribbon. "In speed, perhaps. But you had a way of becoming part of the animal." He smiled at a memory. "Your mother used to say you'd been a wild Mustang in another life." The mention of her mother brought a pang of nostalgia. Elizabeth Griffin had been the one to teach Madeline to ride, to insist that her daughter learn skills that would serve her well in a frontier town, even as she encouraged Madeline's love of books and learning. "I've missed riding," Madeline admitted. "There are stables in San Francisco, of course, but it's not the same as having open land before you." Her father's expression softened. "There are many things San Francisco can offer that Belmont can't, but there are some things that can only be found here." Before Madeline could respond to this thinly veiled observation, the store bell jingled downstairs, signaling Elijah's arrival. Her heart quickened as she checked her appearance one final time in the small mirror above her dresser. "Go on," her father urged. "I'll manage the store while you're gone." "You'll stay in your chair," Madeline corrected, kissing his cheek. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter is coming to help, remember? No climbing ladders or lifting heavy items." Her father waved away her concerns, but the fond smile on his face told her he appreciated her care. "Enjoy your ride, Maddie, and remember what I said." Downstairs, Elijah was waiting by the counter, dressed in his everyday clothes rather than his deputy's attire, a simple shirt, vest, and denim trousers, with a bandana at his throat. He'd left his badge behind, she noticed, though the gun at his hip remained. "Good morning," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her riding clothes with approval. "You remembered how to dress for a Nevada ride, I see." "Some lessons stay with you," she replied, pleased that her voice sounded steady despite the flutter in her stomach. Outside, two horses waited, Elijah's dappled gray and a chestnut mare that Madeline recognized as belonging to the livery stable. "I hope Penny will suit," Elijah said as he helped her mount. "She's gentle but has spirit when you ask it of her." "She's perfect," Madeline assured him, settling into the saddle with a sense of homecoming. Her body remembered this, the feel of a horse beneath her, the subtle adjustments needed to communicate with the animal, the way the world looked different from this vantage point. They rode out of town at an easy pace, exchanging observations about the changes in Belmont and sharing news of mutual acquaintances. It was safe territory, this casual conversation, with none of the undercurrents that had charged their dance the night before. As they left the last buildings behind and the landscape opened up before them, Madeline felt a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to ease. There was something about the vast expanse of sage-dotted land, the distant mountains rising blue and eternal on the horizon, that put human concerns into perspective. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is," she said, drawing her horse to a halt on a small rise that offered a view in all directions. Elijah stopped beside her, his expression softening as he surveyed the land. "It gets in your blood," he agreed. "I tried to leave once, you know, after you went to San Francisco." This was news to Madeline. "You did? Where did you go?" "San Diego," he said, a rueful smile playing at his lips. "Thought I'd try my hand at shipping, maybe work my way up to owning a vessel someday." "What happened?" Madeline asked, trying to imagine Elijah on the California coast, so far from the land that seemed to suit him so perfectly. "Lasted 3 months before the pull of this place brought me back." He gestured to the landscape around them. "Turned out I needed Nevada more than I needed to be anywhere else." More than he needed to be where she was, Madeline thought with a pang. She'd always assumed that Elijah had stayed in Belmont out of stubbornness, out of unwillingness to see beyond the boundaries of the life he'd always known. But what if it had been something else, a genuine connection to this place that was as much a part of him as his blue eyes or his steady hands? "The Henderson place is just over that next ridge," Elijah said, interrupting her thoughts. "Ready," Madeline nodded, urging her horse forward. They crested the ridge side by side, and the valley opened up before them, a sweep of good grazing land bisected by a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. And there, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, was a cabin that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "You built it," Madeline said softly, taking in the sturdy log structure with its stone chimney and covered porch. Elijah nodded, his eyes on the cabin. "Piece by piece over the last 4 years. Started it after I came back from San Diego. Finished the inside work this past winter." There was pride in his voice, but something else too, a vulnerability that tugged at Madeline's heart. He'd built a home here, on land they'd once dreamed of sharing. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Exactly how we imagined it." Elijah turned to look at her then, surprise evident in his expression. "You remember?" "Of course I remember," Madeline replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I remember everything." A moment of perfect understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement that whatever had happened in the years since they'd parted, the dreams they'd shared had not been forgotten by either of them. Then Elijah cleared his throat, gesturing toward the creek. "The new foals are down by the water with their mothers. Come see." They rode down into the valley, the horses picking their way carefully on the sloping ground. As they approached the creek, Madeline caught sight of the mares and their foals, 3 pairs grazing peacefully in the lush grass by the water. "They're magnificent," she breathed, dismounting to approach them on foot. The mares were clearly of good breeding stock, with strong lines and intelligent eyes. The foals, still gangly with youth, pranced around their mothers with the exuberance of new life. "This one's special," Elijah said, pointing to a foal with unusual markings, a dark bay with a perfect white diamond between its eyes. "Born just last week, but already showing signs of being exceptional." "What's his name?" Madeline asked, admiring the foal's spirited movements. Elijah hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. "Don't have one yet," he said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Madeline raised an eyebrow, sensing the evasion. "Elijah Everett, you're not telling me something." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "Diamond," he admitted finally. "I've been calling him Diamond." The significance wasn't lost on Madeline. Years ago, as they'd planned their future on this very land, she told Elijah about a horse she'd loved as a child, a mare named Diamond, for the white mark on her forehead. "You remembered," she said softly. "Like you said," Elijah replied, his eyes holding hers. "I remember everything." The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken words and shared memories. Then one of the foals nickered, breaking the spell, and Elijah suggested they continue on to the cabin for the lunch he'd packed. The cabin was even more impressive up close, well constructed, with attention to detail that spoke of care and craftsmanship. Inside, it was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace at one end and windows positioned to catch the best light. A solid wooden table and chairs occupied the center of the main room, and a staircase led to what Madeline assumed was a sleeping loft above. "It's not fully furnished yet," Elijah explained as he set out the food he'd brought: bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a jar of preserves. "Been focusing on the barn and corrals first. The cattle need shelter more than I need fancy furnishings." "It's perfect," Madeline said, meaning it. The cabin was exactly what they'd talked about all those years ago, not grand, but solid and welcoming, a place where a life could be built. They ate at the table, the open windows allowing a breeze that carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. Their conversation flowed more easily now, ranging from Elijah's plans for his ranch to Madeline's experiences teaching in San Francisco. "The girls are so eager to learn," she told him, her face animated as she described her students. "Many of them will go on to college, something their mothers could never have imagined." "You're changing their lives," Elijah observed, "like your mother did for you." Madeline nodded, touched by his understanding. Her mother had been the one to insist that her daughter receive the best education possible, even in a frontier town like Belmont. It was because of Elizabeth Griffin's persistence that Madeline had been able to attend the Teachers' College in Carson City, and later, to pursue further education in San Francisco. "She would have been proud of what you've accomplished here," she told Elijah, gesturing to the cabin and the land beyond. "Creating something from nothing but hard work and vision." "I hope so," he said, a shadow crossing his face. "She was always kind to me, even when I was just a rancher's son with more dreams than sense." "She saw the man you would become," Madeline said softly. "She told me once that you had the kind of strength that endures, that builds rather than breaks." Elijah's eyes met hers across the table, surprise and something deeper reflected in their blue depths. "I never knew she said that." "There are many things I never told you," Madeline admitted. "Things I should have said before I left." It was as close as she'd come to acknowledging the rift between them, the unresolved pain of their parting. Elijah seemed to recognize it as such, his expression growing serious. "We were young," he said after a moment. "Both of us so certain we knew what we wanted. And now?" Madeline asked before she could stop herself. Elijah considered her question, his gaze never leaving hers. "Now I know what matters, what lasts." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I understand now why you had to leave, Madeline, what you were seeking." The acknowledgement was unexpected, a balm to a wound she hadn't realized was still raw. "And I understand better why this place means so much to you," she replied. "It's not just land, it's possibility." "Yes," he agreed, a smile warming his features. "Exactly that." After lunch, Elijah showed her around the property, the barn he'd built with help from neighbors, the corrals where he was breaking horses to sell, the small orchard he'd planted behind the cabin. Everywhere, Madeline saw evidence of his vision being steadily realized, piece by piece. "You've accomplished so much," she said as they stood by the creek, watching the water rush over stones worn smooth by time. "Everything you dreamed of." "Not everything," Elijah said quietly. Madeline felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken truth behind his words. "Not everything," because she had been part of that dream once. "Elijah," she began, unsure what she wanted to say but feeling that something needed to be spoken. Before she could continue, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted. Looking up, she saw clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. "Storm's coming," Elijah observed, his expression concerned. "We should head back." They rode toward Belmont at a faster pace, trying to outrun the approaching storm. But the clouds moved more quickly than anticipated, and they were still a mile from town when the first fat drops began to fall. "We won't make it before it hits," Elijah called over the rising wind. "There's a line shack just ahead," We can wait it out there. Madeline nodded, hunching lower in her saddle as the rain intensified. By the time they reached the small structure Elijah had indicated, they were both soaked through, their clothes clinging to their skin and water dripping from their hair. The line shack was basic, a single room with a rough bed, a small table, and a pot-bellied stove. But it was dry, and when Elijah lit the stove with supplies stored for just such emergencies, warmth began to seep into the space. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he said, keeping his back to her as he tended the fire. "There are blankets on the bed." Madeline hesitated, but the chill setting into her bones made the decision for her. She removed her sodden jacket and riding skirt, leaving her in her chemise and petticoat. These too were damp, but she drew the line at removing them, instead wrapping one of the rough wool blankets around her shoulders. "You can turn around now," she said, settling on the edge of the bed. Elijah had removed his own vest and shirt, leaving him in an undershirt that did little to conceal the breadth of his shoulders or the lean strength of his arms. He draped his wet clothes over a chair near the stove, then sat on the opposite end of the bed, keeping a respectful distance between them. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the small windows and thunder rumbling overhead. Inside, the only sounds were their breathing and the occasional pop from the stove as it warmed the damp air. "Reminds me of that summer storm," Elijah said finally. "The one that caught us by the creek." Madeline smiled at the memory. "We took shelter under that overhanging rock. You were convinced a mountain lion was going to find us there. And you were the one who spotted the rainbow afterward," he recalled. "Said it was a sign of good things to come." "I was right," Madeline said softly. "That was the day you first kissed me." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with memory and meaning. Elijah's eyes found hers across the small space that separated them, blue and intense in the dim light. "Madeline," he began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something." She nodded, her heart suddenly racing in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "All right. When you left," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen, "did you ever think about coming back, not just to visit your father, but to stay?" It was the question she'd been avoiding since her return to Belmont, the one that lurked beneath every interaction, every remembered dream. Madeline found herself unable to dissemble, not with Elijah looking at her with such raw honesty in his eyes. "Yes," she admitted. "More than I wanted to. More than made sense, given everything I'd worked for in San Francisco." Something shifted in his expression, relief perhaps, or hope. "And now, being back here, seeing what the town has become, what I've built at the Henderson place, does it change anything?" "I don't know," Madeline answered truthfully. "I've built a life in San Francisco, Elijah, a good life." "I know you have," he said, no accusation in his tone, "and I'm proud of you for it. You've become exactly the woman you were meant to be." The simple acknowledgement brought tears to her eyes. This was what had been missing 5 years ago, his recognition of her dreams as being as valid as his own. "Why didn't you say that before?" she asked, the question escaping before she could reconsider. "Before I left," Elijah sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Because I was too afraid of losing you to see that I was pushing you away. I thought if I held tight enough, you'd stay. Instead, I gave you every reason to go." The honesty of his answer disarmed her. "We were both wrong," she said softly. "I ran before we could find a compromise. Before we could see if there was a way for both our dreams to coexist." "And now?" Elijah asked, the question hanging between them like the last echo of thunder as the storm began to recede outside. Madeline looked at him, really looked at the man he'd become in the 5 years since she'd left. The boy she'd loved had matured into someone with depth and strength, someone who had built a life on his own terms but who had also, it seemed, left space in that life for the possibility of her return. "Now I don't know what I want," she confessed. "I thought I did. I was so sure. But being here again, seeing you again." She trailed off, unable to articulate the confusion in her heart. Elijah moved closer on the bed, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I'm not asking for an answer today, Madeline, or tomorrow. But I want you to know something." She met his gaze, waiting. "I never stopped loving you," he said simply. "Not when you left, not when I tried to start over in San Diego, not in all the days since. My heart has been waiting for you all this time, even when my head told me it was foolish." The words hung in the air between them, a truth too powerful to be denied or dismissed. Madeline felt something shift within her, a recognition of what she'd been avoiding since her return to Belmont, that her feelings for Elijah had never truly died, merely been buried beneath layers of independence and pride. "You don't want me," she whispered, an echo of the fear that had driven her away 5 years ago. "Not really. You want the girl I was, the one who fit into your dreams of this place." "No," Elijah said firmly, taking her hand in his. "I want the woman you are now. The one who knows her own mind, who's built a life on her terms. I want the teacher, the thinker, the rider who becomes one with her horse." His eyes held hers steadily. "I want you, Madeline, all of you." "You can't," she protested, even as her heart leapt at his words. "My life is in San Francisco. My work, my friends." "Then why does part of you still fit so perfectly here?" he challenged gently. "Why does your face light up when you ride across open land or when you greet the people of this town who have known you all your life?" His question struck a chord of truth she'd been avoiding. For all that she'd embraced her life in San Francisco, there had always been a piece of her that yearned for the expansiveness of Nevada, for the clarity of its skies and the honesty of its people. "I don't know if I can be both," she said finally, voicing the fear that had kept her from fully acknowledging her conflicted feelings. "The woman I've become in San Francisco and the woman I might be if I stayed here." Elijah's hand tightened around hers. "Why not?" "This isn't the same town you left, Madeline, and I'm not the same man." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "The school needs a proper teacher, someone with training and vision. The children here deserve the best education possible, just as you did." The possibility he was offering shimmered between them, a way to bridge the gap between the life she'd built and the one she'd left behind. A way to honor both the independent woman she'd become and the part of her that had never stopped loving this land and the man before her. "I need time," she said, not pulling her hand away but not giving him the answer he sought either. "To think, to be sure." Elijah nodded, acceptance in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I've waited 5 years. I can wait longer if that's what it takes." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and the faint arch of a rainbow visible through the window. "A sign of good things to come," she had once said. Perhaps it was true again. They rode back to Belmont in companionable silence, the air between them clearer than it had been since her return. Nothing was resolved, yet everything had changed. Madeline had spoken truths she'd been avoiding, and Elijah had offered a vision of a future she hadn't allowed herself to consider. As they reached the edge of town, Elijah drew his horse to a halt, turning to face her. "Whatever you decide," he said simply, "know that my heart has been waiting for you all this time, and it will keep waiting for as long as it takes." Madeline nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Then they rode the rest of the way to the general store, where her father waited, his knowing eyes taking in their damp clothes and the unspoken current between them. That night, As Madeline lay in her bed listening to the drip of water from the eaves, the last remnant of the afternoon storm, she allowed herself to truly consider the possibility Elijah had offered. A life in Belmont, but not as the girl she'd been. A life that honored the woman she'd become while embracing the part of her that had never stopped loving this place and the man who had built a home with space for her in it. Could she do it? Could she find a way to bring her San Francisco self to Belmont without losing all she'd gained in the years away? Could she trust that Elijah truly wanted the woman she'd become, not just the memory of who she'd been? The questions followed her into sleep, but for the first time since her return to Belmont, they didn't bring anxiety. Instead, they carried a whisper of possibility, of a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine but that now seemed tantalizingly within reach. The week following her day at the Henderson place brought a shift in Madeline's perspective on Belmont. Where before she'd seen only a small town with limited possibilities, now she began to notice the signs of growth and change: the new school building under construction at the edge of town, the young families settling in as the railroad brought new opportunities, the sense of community that pervaded even the most ordinary interactions. She found herself observing the children who came into the store with their parents, noting their curiosity and intelligence, thinking about the kind of education that might open doors for them as it had for her. She lingered in conversation with Emma, learning about her friend's hopes for her young son and the other children of Belmont. The town council's been trying to recruit a proper teacher, Emma told her as they shared tea in the Griffin's kitchen one afternoon. They've even set aside funds for a good salary, but it's hard to convince someone qualified to move to a place like Belmont. The right person would see the potential, Madeline found herself saying. The chance to build something meaningful. Emma gave her a searching look. Someone like you, perhaps? Madeline sidestepped the question, but it lingered in her mind. Could she be that person? Could she bring her experience and training to this place that had first inspired her love of learning? Her father watched her changing perspective with quiet satisfaction, offering observations but never pushing. "The town's different now," he remarked as they closed the store one evening. "Growing into something new. Might need people who have seen a bit more of the world to help guide that growth." She saw Elijah daily, though they hadn't spoken privately since their rain-soaked conversation in the line shack. He continued his duties as deputy, stopping by the store on his rounds, tipping his hat to her with a smile that held promise but no pressure. He was giving her the time she'd asked for, respecting her need to find her own answer without his influence. Then, 10 days after the social, everything changed with the arrival of a telegram from San Francisco. The Bennett School for Girls regretted to inform Miss Griffin that due to unforeseen financial difficulties, they would be reducing their teaching staff for the coming term. Her position would not be continued. Madeline read the telegram twice, shock giving way to a strange mixture of disappointment and something that felt uncomfortably like relief. Her carefully constructed future in San Francisco had vanished in a few terse lines of text. Bad news. Her father asked, noting her expression as she stood by the store's counter, the telegram still in her hand. "My position at the school," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "It's gone. Budget cuts." Her father's face registered sympathy, but Madeline caught the flicker of hope in his eyes before he schooled his expression. "I'm sorry, Maddie. I know how much your work there meant to you." "It did," she agreed, folding the telegram and tucking it into her pocket. "It was security, independence, a purpose." "And now?" her father asked carefully. "Now I don't know," she admitted. "I could look for another position in the city, I suppose. There are other schools." "Or," her father prompted, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes. Madeline sighed, moving to the store window to look out at Belmont's Main Street, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows and turned the dust to gold. "Or I could stay," she said softly, giving voice to the possibility that had been growing in her mind even before the telegram's arrival. "I could teach here." Her father joined her at the window, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "You could," he agreed, "but only if it's what you truly want, Maddie, not out of obligation to me or anyone else." "I don't know what I want," she confessed, "or rather, I want contradictory things. I want the life I've built in San Francisco, the independence, the intellectual stimulation, but I also want—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex yearning she felt when she thought of staying in Belmont. "You want him," her father said gently. "There's no shame in that, Maddie. Loving someone doesn't make you less independent or less yourself." "Doesn't it?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for 5 years finally spoken aloud. "I left because I was afraid of disappearing into his dreams, of losing sight of my own." "And now?" her father prompted. "Do you still have that fear?" Madeline considered the question honestly. "No," she said finally. "Elijah's changed, or perhaps I'm seeing him more clearly now. He doesn't want to contain me or direct my path. He wants to walk alongside me." "Then perhaps the question isn't whether you stay in Belmont or return to San Francisco," her father suggested. "Perhaps it's whether you're brave enough to believe that you can be both the woman you've become and the woman who could love and be loved in return." His words struck a chord of truth within her. The real choice wasn't between two places but between two versions of herself, one defined by independence alone, and one that embraced both independence and connection. "I need to think," she said, reaching for her shawl. "Would you mind watching the store for a while? I'm going to walk." Her father nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need, I'll be here." Madeline stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine, her mind racing with the implications of the telegram and her father's insights. Without a conscious destination, she found herself walking toward the edge of town, where the new school building was taking shape. It was a modest structure, but solidly built, with large windows designed to let in light and air. The workmen had gone for the day, leaving the site quiet as Madeline approached. She stood before it, imagining children filling its rooms, minds opening to new ideas and possibilities. "It'll be ready by September," a voice said behind her, and Madeline turned to find Sheriff Davis approaching, his badge catching the sunlight. "Just in time for the fall term if we can find someone to teach." "It's well designed," Madeline observed, nodding toward the building. "Whoever planned it understands what makes a good learning environment." Sheriff Davis smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "That would be my deputy. Seems he picked up some ideas about proper schoolhouses from someone who knew a thing or two about education." Madeline couldn't hide her surprise. "Elijah designed this," the sheriff nodded. "Drew up the plans himself, based on descriptions of schools back east. Convinced the town council it was worth the extra expense for the windows and the separate cloakroom." He paused, studying her reaction. "Said every child in Belmont deserved the kind of education that opens doors, whether they stay here or go out into the wider world." The words, so similar to what Madeline herself believed, sent a wave of emotion through her. Elijah hadn't just built a home with space for her. He'd helped create a place where her most deeply held values could find expression. "Sheriff," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to frame her question. "Do you know if the town council has considered candidates for the teaching position?" Sheriff Davis's expression turned thoughtful. "They've advertised in Carson City and as far as Reno, but so far, no one with the right qualifications has expressed interest." He gave her a measured look. though I believe they'd be mighty interested if someone with experience teaching at a respected school for girls in San Francisco were to apply. Madeline felt a smile tugging at her lips despite the turmoil in her heart. "Is that so?" "It is indeed, Miss Griffin," the sheriff confirmed. "In fact, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting with the council as early as tomorrow, should such a candidate wish to discuss the position." "I'll consider it," Madeline said, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Thank you, Sheriff." As Davis tipped his hat and continued on his rounds, Madeline remained before the school building, seeing it now through new eyes, not as a symbol of Belmont's limitations, but as evidence of its potential. A potential she could help shape, if she chose to stay. But the decision wasn't that simple, she reminded herself as she continued her walk, circling back toward town as the sun began to set. Staying in Belmont meant more than just taking a teaching position. It meant confronting the feelings that still existed between her and Elijah, deciding whether she was ready to risk her heart again with a man who claimed to want the woman she'd become, but who was still, in many ways, tied to the past they'd shared. As if summoned by her thoughts, she spotted Elijah at the far end of the street, speaking with a group of men outside the bank that was nearing completion. He was in his element, she realized, respected, engaged with the community, building something meaningful in this place he'd chosen as his own. She watched him for a moment, unobserved, noting the confidence in his stance, the way the other men listened when he spoke. This wasn't the impetuous young man she'd left behind, but someone who had grown into his own strength while maintaining the core of integrity that had first drawn her to him. As if sensing her presence, Elijah looked up, his eyes finding hers across the distance. A smile curved his lips, warm and genuine, with no hint of expectation or demand, just pleasure at the sight of her. Madeline smiled back before turning toward the store, her decision still unmade but clearer in her mind than it had been. She had lost one future with the arrival of the telegram, but perhaps another was offering itself in its place, one that encompassed both the woman she'd become and the woman she'd always been, deep inside. That night, after her father had gone to bed, Madeline sat at the small desk in her room and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the headmistress of the Bennett School, expressing gratitude for the opportunities she'd been given and formally resigning her position. The second was to her landlady in San Francisco, asking her to pack and ship Madeline's belongings to Belmont, Nevada. As she sealed the second envelope, a sense of peace settled over her, not the certainty that she was making the right choice, but the recognition that there was no perfect choice, only the one that felt true to the woman she had become, and the one she hoped to be. Tomorrow, she would speak with the town council about the teaching position, and after that, she would find Elijah and tell him what she had realized during her walk by the new schoolhouse, that her heart, too, had been waiting all this time, even when she'd been too afraid to admit it. Morning brought a crystalline clarity to Belmont, the kind of day when the mountains seemed close enough to touch and every sound carried on the still air. Madeline rose early, dressing with care in one of her more formal San Francisco dresses, a statement of intent for the meeting with the town council that Sheriff Davis had arranged for 10 o'clock. Her father eyed her appearance with approval as she joined him for breakfast. "You look ready to convince them," he observed, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Not that they'll need much convincing, I suspect." "I'm still not certain," Madeline admitted, smoothing her skirts nervously. "What if I'm making a mistake? What if I'm letting go of everything I worked for in San Francisco for a dream that might not be what I imagine?" "That's the risk of any choice," her father said gently. "But ask yourself this: which would you regret more? Trying and finding it isn't what you hoped, or never trying at all?" The question resonated with Madeline, echoing her own thoughts during the night. She'd left Belmont once, running from what felt like constraint but might have been possibility. She'd built a life elsewhere, only to find herself drawn back to the place and the people she'd left behind. Perhaps the true mistake would be leaving again without discovering what might be possible now. "I'm going to do this," she said, as much to herself as to her father. "I'm going to apply for the teaching position and see what happens." Her father reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "That's my Maddie. Always brave enough to follow her heart, even when it takes her in unexpected directions." The town council met in a room above the new bank, a space that still smelled of fresh lumber and paint. 5 men, including Sheriff Davis and Mr. Patterson, the general store's former owner, and now the town's mayor, sat at a long table, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope as Madeline entered. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach, "I understand you're seeking a teacher for Belmont's new school. I'd like to offer my services." What followed was less an interview than a conversation about her vision for the school, a place where children would learn not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but how to think critically, to question, to see beyond the boundaries of their small town while appreciating its unique strengths. "Our children deserve the best education possible," she told them, passion warming her voice. "Not just those who might leave Belmont someday, but those who will stay and build its future. They need to understand the wider world even as they learn to value this place and its history." By the time the meeting concluded, Madeline knew she had convinced them. The salary they offered was less than she'd earned in San Francisco, but enough to live comfortably, especially with the added advantage of the small house attached to the school that would be provided for the teacher's use. "We'll need your answer by the end of the week," Mayor Patterson said as they shook hands. "Though I believe I speak for all of us when I say we hope that answer will be yes." "You'll have my decision tomorrow," Madeline promised, her mind already made up but wanting one more conversation before she formalized her commitment to Belmont. That conversation awaited her at the foot of the stairs leading down from the council room. Elijah stood there, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty as she descended. He'd clearly been waiting for her, though he hadn't intruded on the meeting itself. "Sheriff Davis told me," he said simply as she reached him, "about your interview with the council." Madeline nodded, suddenly aware of the curious eyes watching them from across the street. "Walk with me," she suggested, indicating the direction away from the main thoroughfare. They fell into step beside each other, neither speaking until they had reached the relative privacy of a small park at the edge of town, little more than a few benches beneath cottonwood trees, but peaceful in the late morning light. "I lost my position in San Francisco," Madeline said as they settled on a bench. "The school is reducing staff due to financial difficulties." "I'm sorry," Elijah said, his tone genuine. "I know how much your work there meant to you." "It did," she agreed. "But perhaps it was meant to happen this way." She turned to face him directly. "The council has offered me the teaching position here." Hope flared in Elijah's eyes, but he controlled it, his voice careful as he asked, "And what did you tell them?" "That I'll give them my answer tomorrow," Madeline said. "But first, I needed to talk to you, to me." Elijah's surprise was evident in his tone. "Why?" Madeline took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Because my decision to stay in Belmont isn't just about the teaching position. It's also about us, about what might be possible between us now 5 years after I left." Elijah's expression softened, a vulnerability in his eyes that matched her own. "What do you think might be possible, Madeline?" "I don't know," she admitted honestly, "but I want to find out if you do too." His hand found hers on the bench between them, his fingers warm and steady as they interlaced with hers. "I told you my heart has been waiting for you," he said softly. "That hasn't changed. But I need to know, are you staying because you lost your position in San Francisco or because you want to be here with me?" It was the question Madeline had asked herself through the night, the one she needed to answer not just for Elijah but for herself. "Both," she said finally. "The telegram forced me to confront a choice I was already considering. But if I stay, it will be because I choose to, not because circumstances forced my hand." "And do you," Elijah asked, his voice low and intense, "choose to stay?" Madeline looked at him, really looked at the man before her, with his earnest blue eyes and the lines that 5 years had etched at their corners, the strength in his hands and the steadiness in his gaze. She thought of the cabin he'd built, the school he'd helped design, the life he'd created that seemed to have space already carved out for her if she chose to claim it. "Yes," she said, the word both a conclusion and a beginning. "I choose to stay, to teach in the school you helped create, to see what we might become together, now that we've both had time to grow into ourselves." The joy that transformed Elijah's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once brilliant. His hand tightened around hers, and his other rose to touch her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Madeline Griffin," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "Do you have any idea how long I've waited to hear you say that?" 5 years, she answered, smiling through the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. "Too long." "Worth every minute," Elijah replied, leaning forward to rest his forehead against hers. "If it meant you came back to me as yourself, not as someone trying to fit into a future that wasn't of your own making." In that moment, Madeline understood with perfect clarity what her father had been trying to tell her, that love, real love, didn't diminish you or constrain you. It expanded you, creating space for growth and change while providing the security of being truly known and accepted. "I'm still not sure how to be both the woman I became in San Francisco and the woman who could be happy here," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to find out, with you. We'll figure it out together," Elijah promised, "day by day." Then, with a smile that held all the warmth of the Nevada sun, he asked, "May I kiss you, Miss Griffin, for the first time in 5 years and for all the years to come?" Madeline's answer was to close the distance between them herself, her lips finding his with a certainty that belied all her earlier doubts. The kiss was both familiar and new, a recognition of who they had been to each other and a promise of who they might become. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Elijah kept his arms around her as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. "I love you," he said simply. "The you that left and the you that came back, all of you always." "And I love you," Madeline replied, the words coming easily now without the fear that had once accompanied them. "Enough to leave once and enough to return. Enough to stay." They walked back toward town hand in hand. Their steps matched as if they'd been walking together all along instead of on separate paths for 5 years. As they approached the general store, Madeline saw her father watching from the window, his face alight with satisfaction as he took in their clasped hands and matching smiles. "I should tell him," she said, reluctant to let go of Elijah's hand, but knowing her father deserved to hear her decision directly. "I'll come back later," Elijah agreed. "There's something I need to fetch from the ranch first, something I've been keeping for a long time." Curiosity flared in Madeline, but she didn't press him, simply squeezing his hand before releasing it. Until later, then. Her father was waiting inside, pretending to arrange merchandise but clearly having abandoned the task to watch for her return. "Well," he asked as soon as she entered. "Did you accept the position?" "I did," Madeline confirmed, her smile widening as she spoke the words aloud. "I'm staying, Father. I'm going to teach in Belmont's new school." "And Elijah?" her father prompted, though the knowing look in his eyes suggested he'd already guessed the answer from seeing them together. "We're going to see what's possible," Madeline said, a warm certainty settling in her chest. "Now that we've both had time to become the people we needed to be." Her father enfolded her in a hug that smelled of tobacco and the familiar scent of the store leather and coffee and the faint sweetness of candy. "I'm happy for you, Maddie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother would be too." "I think she'd be proud," Madeline agreed, returning his embrace, "of the choice I'm making and the reason I'm making it." The rest of the day passed in a haze of planning and preparation. Madeline wrote to the town council formally accepting the position, then spent hours discussing her ideas for the school with her father, who had once served on the school board himself. They talked of curriculum and books, of ways to engage children who might otherwise be destined for lives of manual labor, of how to honor Belmont's history while preparing its children for a future that might take them far beyond Nevada's borders. As evening approached, Madeline found herself growing increasingly restless, watching the door for Elijah's return. When he finally appeared, the last light of day was fading, casting long shadows across the main street. "Come with me," he said by way of greeting, his eyes bright with some secret joy. "There's something I want to show you." Curious, Madeline followed him outside, where his horse waited alongside the chestnut mare she'd ridden to the Henderson place. "Where are we going?" she asked as he helped her mount. "You'll see," he replied, swinging into his own saddle with practiced ease. They rode out of town as twilight deepened into dusk, the first stars appearing overhead like scattered diamonds on indigo velvet. Madeline soon recognized the direction they were heading toward the Henderson place, toward the cabin Elijah had built and the land they had once dreamed of sharing. As they crested the ridge that revealed the valley below, Madeline gasped. The cabin was aglow with light lanterns hung from the porch, their warm golden radiance spilling across the yard and reflecting in the creek beyond. It looked like a beacon in the gathering darkness, a promise of home and hearth. "What is all this?" she asked as they approached, the beauty of the scene bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "A welcome," Elijah said simply, dismounting and coming to help her from her horse. "And a question." He led her to the porch, where a small table had been set with a white cloth, 2 plates and a bottle of wine. Candles flickered in the center, their flames steady in the still evening air. "It's beautiful," Madeline breathed, taking in the care with which the scene had been arranged. "But I don't understand." Elijah took both her hands in his expression more serious than she'd seen it since her return to Belmont. "5 years ago," he began, "I asked you to stay in a way that made you feel you had to choose between your dreams and mine. I was wrong then, and I've regretted it every day since." Madeline started to speak, but he shook his head gently, asking for her silence until he finished. "Today, I'm asking you something different," he continued. "Not to give up your dreams for mine, but to join our dreams together. To make a life here that honors who you are and who I am, and who we might become together." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box, simple, wooden, polished to a warm glow. "I made this the day after you left," he said, opening it to reveal a ring nestled inside. "And I've kept it all this time, hoping that someday you might come back and I might have the chance to ask you properly." The ring was unique, a band of gold supporting not a traditional diamond, but a small, perfect piece of fire opal. Its depths flashing blue and green and gold like the Nevada sky at different times of day. "Madeline Griffin," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Not because it's expected or because it's the way things are done, but because together we can build something neither of us could create alone. A life that encompasses your passion for teaching and my love for this land. A home where your independence is valued as much as our connection." Madeline looked at the man before her, at the ring he offered, at the home he'd built that seemed to be waiting for her presence to make it complete. She thought of the school she would teach in, the children whose lives she might shape, the community that had welcomed her back with open arms. And she thought of her younger self, running from what she'd perceived as constraint, only to discover that true freedom came not from absence of connection, but from the right connection, one that expanded rather than diminished, that challenged rather than restricted. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised even her. "Yes, I'll marry you, Elijah. Not because I'm giving up my dreams, but because together we can create new ones." His smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once brilliant. "Then why's my heart been waiting this long?" he whispered, echoing the words he'd spoken in the line shack during the storm. "It's always been you, Madeline, always." "And it's always been you," she replied, lifting her face to his. "Even when I was too afraid to admit it." Their kiss in the lamplight was a promise of patience and passion, of dreams shared and challenges faced together, of a love that had endured separation and grown stronger for the waiting. Later, as they sat at the table Elijah had prepared, sharing the meal he'd cooked and the wine he'd saved for a special occasion, Madeline looked around at the cabin that would soon be their home and felt a sense of rightness that transcended logic or reason. "Tell me about your plans for the school," Elijah said, his interest genuine as he refilled her glass. "What do you envision for the children of Belmont?" And so she did, outlining her ideas for a curriculum that would prepare students not just for practical work, but for further education if they chose it, for incorporating the natural world around them into their studies, for teaching history that included the perspectives of all who had shaped the West: native peoples, settlers, Chinese railroad workers, Mexican vaqueros. Elijah listened, offering suggestions from his own experience, asking thoughtful questions that showed he valued her expertise. Then he shared his plans for the ranch, the breeding program he was developing, the additional acreage he hoped to acquire, the experiments with drought-resistant grasses that might improve the grazing quality of the land. As they talked, their future took shape between them, not as a compromise where one dream dominated the other, but as a shared vision where both could flourish. They would live here, on the land Elijah had cultivated, and Madeline would teach in the school they both had helped to create in different ways. Their lives would intertwine without either losing its essential character. "It won't always be easy," Elijah acknowledged as the hour grew late and the candles burned low. "There will be days when your teaching demands more of you than seems possible, or when the ranch requires my attention when you need me elsewhere." "Nothing worthwhile is ever easy," Madeline replied, her hand finding his across the table, "but we'll figure it out together, day by day." They rode back to town beneath a canopy of stars, their horses walking close enough that their legs occasionally brushed, a casual intimacy that felt both new and familiar. At the door of the general store, Elijah kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that held the promise of all the nights to come when they wouldn't have to part. "Tomorrow?" he asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Tomorrow," she confirmed, already looking forward to the next day, the next week, the next year, all the tomorrows that stretched before them like the vast Nevada sky, boundless and bright with possibility. The following morning, Madeline officially accepted the teaching position with the town council. Her decision met with enthusiasm and relief. In the weeks that followed, she threw herself into preparations for the school's opening in September, ordering books, developing lesson plans, and visiting the families of her future students to introduce herself and learn about their needs and expectations. Elijah continued his duties as deputy while working on their home, adding touches that he knew would please Madeline: bookshelves for her collection, a desk positioned to catch the morning light, a small garden plot where she could grow the herbs and flowers she loved. They were married in late August, just before the school term began, in a ceremony beside the creek on their land. The entire town turned out to celebrate, the festivity lasting well into the night, with dancing and feasting and heartfelt wishes for their future together. As husband and wife, they established a rhythm that honored both their individual pursuits and their shared life. Madeline's days were filled with teaching, her natural talent blossoming in a classroom where she could put her ideas into practice. Elijah divided his time between his duties as deputy, which expanded when Sheriff Davis appointed him unofficial undersheriff, and the development of their ranch, which grew steadily more successful under his careful management. In the evenings, they shared the day's events over meals in their cabin, offering each other support and perspective. On weekends, they worked together on projects around the property or rode out to explore the land that had become their shared domain. Their first child, a son they named William, after Elijah's father was born the following summer, his arrival greeted with joy by the entire community. Madeline took a brief respite from teaching but returned in the fall, bringing baby William with her in a cradle set up in the corner of the classroom. The older students took turns watching him when he was awake, learning lessons in responsibility and care that were as valuable as those in their books. 2 years later, their daughter Elizabeth, named for Madeline's mother, joined the family, her arrival coinciding with Sheriff Davis's retirement and Elijah's appointment as the new sheriff of Belmont. The position brought new responsibilities, but also increased stability for their family, allowing them to expand their ranch operations with the help of hired hands who managed the day-to-day work, while Elijah oversaw the broader operation. As the children grew, they embodied the blend of their parents' qualities: William with Elijah's steady nature and Madeline's love of books, Elizabeth with her mother's independent spirit and her father's affinity for the land. They were raised in a home where education was valued alongside practical skills, where questions were encouraged and dreams supported, where the wider world was discussed around the dinner table, even as the beauty of their own small corner of it was celebrated daily. Madeline's school flourished under her guidance, eventually expanding to 2 rooms with the addition of another teacher as Belmont continued to grow. Her students went on to further education in greater numbers than ever before, some returning to enrich the town with new skills and perspectives, others venturing out into the wider world but carrying with them the values and knowledge she had instilled. Elijah's service as sheriff established him as a cornerstone of the community, his fair-handed approach to law enforcement earning respect from even those who occasionally found themselves on the wrong side of it. Under his watch, Belmont navigated the changes brought by the railroad and increased settlement without succumbing to the lawlessness that plagued some growing towns. Together, they built a life that neither could have imagined alone: richer, more complex, more satisfying than the separate dreams they had once held. Their home became a gathering place for the community, a center of learning and hospitality where ideas were exchanged alongside stories and songs. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, They would often sit on the porch of the cabin Elijah had built, watching the stars emerge above the land they both loved, their hands clasped between them in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Do you ever regret it?" Elijah asked her once, years into their marriage, as they celebrated the anniversary of her return to Belmont. "Staying here instead of returning to San Francisco?" Madeline considered the question honestly, as she had taught her students and her children to consider all questions. "No," she said finally, her gaze taking in the home they had built together, the land that had flourished under their care, the community they had helped to shape. "I regret the years we lost, but not the choice I made to stay." "Then why's my heart been waiting this long?" Elijah said softly, echoing the words that had become a refrain between them, a reminder of the time when they had found each other again after years of separation. "Because some things are worth waiting for," Madeline replied, leaning against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And some hearts know what they need before the mind is ready to accept it." And in the years that followed, as their children grew, and eventually brought grandchildren to play by the creek where Madeline and Elijah had once planned their future. As the school Madeline had nurtured produced generations of students who carried her influence into the world. As the town of Belmont evolved from a mining outpost to a thriving community, they remained each other's constant, the center from which all else radiated. Their love, tested by separation and strengthened by choice, became a beacon for those around them, a testament to the power of hearts that wait, of dreams that evolve, and of lives built on the foundation of mutual respect and enduring affection.